Welcome to the Forge Conversations. If you have been with me since the first episode, thank you for traveling with me so far. In the very first episode of this series, I asked you to picture an orchestra. Leadership, I said, can feel like conducting dozens of instruments at once. Priorities and stakeholders, deadlines and expectations, all of it demanding to be held in alignment at the same moment. It was a useful image, a leader standing at the center, trying to keep everything in time. Something has shifted as this journey moved through focus, overcome, reinvent, and grow. Another metaphor came to my mind. Leadership is not just coordination. Instead, it is movement through conditions you did not choose. It is uncertainty that refuses to resolve. It is adaptation again and again to situations that keep changing while you are still deciding what to do about the last one. And for that, the orchestra is no longer enough. For that, I think we need a sailboat. Consider the difference. A conductor controls the tempo. A movement of his hand makes the entire group of musicians obey, while a sailor controls nothing of the kind. The sailor does not command the wind, does not negotiate with the current, does not vote on the weather. The sailor learns to work with forces that are entirely indifferent to a plan he might have prepared. I'm Alain Coadou. I study what happens when human beings remain under pressure for too long. The invisible erosion that occurs before anyone, including the person themselves, notices that something has gone wrong. In this series, we explore the Forge framework, a 5-part architecture for leaders navigating the territory I call drift. The long quiet period when performance remains externally intact while something essential fragments underneath. In our previous episodes, we explored focus, the recovery of attentional clarity when everything has begun competing at the same volume. Overcome, the work of identifying what we carry and developing the discernment to know what still belongs to us. Reinvent, the deliberate updating of the internal operating system through which a leader thinks, regulates, decides, and defines success. And grow, the rebuilding of the conditions under which sustainable development becomes possible again. Today we enter the 5th and final movement, the letter E, E for excel. Before we move forward, I want to draw a line between grow and excel. Grow was about becoming stronger. Excel is about using that strength wisely. Grow asked how capability develops. Excel asks what happens when that capability finally meets reality. Development and performance are not the same thing. Many leaders grow, but fewer ones learn to express what they have grown into with consistency. Hold that image, because by the end of this episode, I want to suggest something that may reframe the entire Forge journey for you. The idea that perhaps it was never really about performance. Perhaps it was always about navigation. Let me bring you back to the idea that has carried this whole series. Drift. We began in the first episodes with a leader who was no longer steering. Not because of any single failure, but because of an accumulation. Chronic pressure that never quite released its grip. Reactions that had become automatic, fired off before any real thought arrived. Attention narrowing week by week until the horizon shrank to the next meeting, the next escalation, the next thing on fire. And underneath all of it, the slow loss of intentionality. The quiet disappearance of the question, why am I doing this in the first place? That is drift. The progressive loss of internal coherence while the external performance still looks intact. The numbers hold, the leader holds, and inside, something has quietly shifted. Now, here is a question that opens this final episode. What is the opposite of drift? The first answer that comes to mind is control. if drift is carried by forces you did not choose, then surely the solution is to take command. Tighten the grip, master every variable, and leave no space to chance. Even if control can sometimes be useful, I want to gently take that answer away from you. Because control for a senior leader operating in real conditions is largely an illusion. You do not control the market. You do not control the regulator, the geopolitics, the supply chain, or the high performer in your team who resigns on a Tuesday morning. As a leader, trying to organize stability on control is an impossible task. The opposite of drift is not control. The opposite of drift is navigation. The sailor does not pretend to command the ocean. The sailor accepts that the wind will do what the wind does and chooses, within that, where to point the bow. Navigation is the art of moving with intention through conditions you cannot dictate. So the real question of this episode becomes this: what allows some leaders to navigate uncertainty while others are slowly consumed by it? Two leaders, the same storm. One arrives somewhere, the other is simply carried away. What is the difference between them? That is what the science of human performance can help us understand. So let's go there. Let me introduce you to two researchers, Arnold Becker and Michael Leiter. They have spent their careers studying something they call work engagement. Their question was simple. What is the actual fuel of sustained high performance? What keeps people fully present in demanding work year after year without it slowly emptying them? They describe engagement through three dimensions. The first is vigor, physical and psychological energy, the sense of having something to give to the work, rather than only something to defend against it. The second is dedication, meaning significance and a willingness to commit, because the work connects to something you actually care about. And the third is absorption, being so fully inside the task that the noise around it falls away. Now here is the insight that I want you to sit with, because it overturns one of the deepest assumptions of senior leadership. Excellence is not sustained by pressure. Excellence is sustained by engagement. Picture two regional directors in an industrial group, same scope, same brutal quarter, same impossible targets handed down from the headquarter. The first runs on pressure. Every day is a threat to be survived, every result a verdict on his worth. He works enormous hours, and each effort costs him something he is not getting back. The second runs on engagement. The targets are just as hard, but they connect to something he finds genuinely worth doing. He works hard too, and somehow the work returns energy to him, even as it demands it. Many leaders confuse these two states. They mistake pressure for commitment because both produce long hours and visible intensity. But they are not the same thing, and the difference reveals itself over time. Pressure consumes energy. Engagement generates it. Here is the first question you can carry out of this episode. Which fuel are you burning this week? The kind that costs you something you do not get back, or the kind that returns energy even as it asks for it? Two equally capable executives under identical strain can end the year in completely different conditions. Often the only difference is their fuel. There is a state that sits at the very heart of engagement, and it has a name you may have heard: flow. The researcher who brought this idea was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian psychologist who spent years asking a simple question: when are people most alive in what they do? What he found was a particular state available to surgeons, musicians, chess players, and yes, to leaders. In that state, performance feels almost effortless from the inside, even when it looks anything but effortless from the outside. Flow has a recognizable shape. There is a balance between the challenge in front of you and the skill you bring to it. If it is too easy, you drift into boredom. If too hard, you fall into anxiety. But when challenge and capability meet, something opens. Concentration deepens, time distorts, and an hour passes like a few minutes. The motivation comes from inside the work itself, rather than from the reward waiting at the end of it. Let's return to the sailor for a moment. The sailor in flow is not fighting every wave. Fighting the sea is exhausting and pointless, and the sea will always win. Instead, the sailor is reading the wind on the water, the movements of the clouds, the angle of the boat. He is adjusting continuously, lightly, almost without deliberation, because his skills and the conditions have met in a kind of conversation. I remember a sales director I worked with. He was deep in a difficult negotiation that should have been agony. He spent hours on it. The stakes were high, every sentence was carrying weight. Afterward, he told me something strange. He said he had completely lost track of time. During all these hours, he had felt clearer, more present, more himself than he had in months. The challenge was enormous, and it had met something in him that was equal to it. This example brings us to a question you can think about. Where in your work are you anxious right now? And where are you bored? Both are telling you the same thing. They tell you that challenge and skill have slipped out of balance, and one of them needs to move. Because the deepest performance frequently feels less like strain than outsiders imagine. Sadly, the strain we so often glorify may simply be a sign that something is out of balance. Let me introduce a third researcher, K. Anders Ericsson. His work reshaped how we understand expertise. And let me do it through a sentence that almost every senior leader has either said or heard. I have been leading for 20 years. It sounds like an argument. 20 years of experience. Surely that is the same as 20 years of mastery. Ericsson spent his career demonstrating that it is not. Experience and expertise are not the same currency. Because some leaders, he would argue, do not accumulate 20 years of growth. They repeat the same year 20 times. The same instincts, the same blind spots, the same moves, gradually hardening into habit and then into identity. The experience is real, but the development stopped a long time ago. What separates the two is something Ericsson called deliberate practice. It has a structure. It requires feedback, the honest signal about what is actually working. It requires refinement, the patient adjustment of technique, rather than effort repeated without change. It requires experimentation, the willingness to try the thing you are not yet good at, and it requires conscious improvement, attention turned deliberately on your own performance, rather than only on the outcomes it produces. Imagine two leaders preparing for a presentation to top management. The first has delivered presentations like this for 20 years and prepares the way he always has. The second reviews the recording of his last one, asks a trusted colleague where he lost the room, experiments with the structure, and deliberately sharpens one element each time. Both will walk into that boardroom with experience behind them. Only one of them is practicing. And over a career, that gap does not stay small. It widens year after year. This is uncomfortable territory for accomplished leaders. Let me explain why. The more senior you become, the less feedback reaches you. The room grows quieter around your decisions. People tell you what they believe you want to hear. The very success that elevated you begins to insulate you from the signals you would need to keep growing. Return one last time to the water. The ocean keeps changing. The conditions that made a sailor expert 10 years ago are not the conditions of today. The sailor who stops learning, who relies entirely on the instincts of a younger sea, eventually finds those instincts betraying him in waters he no longer recognizes. So, here comes a question worth considering. Are you accumulating years? Or are you accumulating mastery? And if you are honest that the feedback has gone quiet around you, there is a smaller, sharper question underneath. Who could you ask for the signal you have stopped receiving? Now I want to turn from what high performers do to what they carry inside. And for that we turn to Fred Luthans and a concept he named psychological capital. Capital is a deliberate word. We speak easily of financial capital, of human capital, of social capital. Luthans argued that there is also a psychological capital, a measurable, buildable internal resource that high performers draw on. That capital has 4 dimensions. The first is hope, not just optimism, but the specific belief that roots can be found, that when one path closes, another can be located. The second is efficacy, confidence in your own capability to handle what arrives, grounded in evidence rather than in pretending. The third is resilience, the capacity to recover after a setback, to take the hit and remain standing. And the fourth is optimism, the expectation that effort can actually influence outcomes, that what you do is not irrelevant to what happens. So here is the message I most want you to take from Luthans, because it dismantles a myth that quietly damages a great many leaders. High performers are not mentally stronger because they suffer less. They suffer. They are knocked down, doubted, defeated, humiliated like everyone else. What distinguishes them is not the absence of difficulty. It is the quality of their recovery. Imagine an expatriate executive sent to lead a launch in an unfamiliar market, far from her home and her network. She does everything well, but the launch fails anyway, for reasons that were never fully in her hands. A leader without psychological capital reads that failure as a verdict. The market has spoken, and it has spoken about her. She begins to drift. A leader with psychological capital reads the same failure as information. Hope tells her another route exists. Efficacy tells her she is capable of finding it. Resilience lets her absorb the blow without collapsing into it. Optimism tells her the next effort is worth making. The failure is identical. The recovery is what makes the difference. So here is a question to carry out. After your last real setback, did you work the recovery or did you work the verdict? In addition, the bright side of Luthans' work is this. These 4 resources, hope, efficacy, optimism, resilience, are not fixed traits you are either born with or denied. They can be built. This brings us to the model that ties the whole episode together. In the previous movement, Grow, we explored the psychological conditions that allow human beings to develop: autonomy, competence, relatedness. But once those capacities exist, the question evolves. How do we sustain performance day after day in genuinely demanding environments? To understand that, we need another model. The model is called the Job Demands Resources model. If Grow was about creating the conditions for development, then Excel is about operating within those conditions, day after day, in a way that lasts. And this model gives us the practical mechanics of how it can be done. It begins with a simple observation. Every leader in every role faces 2 forces at once. On one side are demands, pressure, deadlines, complexity, the weight of responsibility that comes with a senior seat. On the other side are resources, autonomy, the support of others, your own competence, genuine recovery and meaning, the sense that the effort connects to something that matters. Now hold those two forces side by side, because their relationship determines everything. When demands continuously exceed resources, the result, over time, is burnout. The vessel takes on more water than it can pump out, and eventually it sinks, no matter how skilled the sailor is. But when resources are sufficient to support the demands, something very different happens. Engagement. The same demands that would have drowned an under-resourced leader become, for a well-resourced one, a challenge worth addressing. This is the practical insight I most want to leave you with from the science. So much of leadership culture obsesses over reducing demands. Do less, say no, protect the calendar. And there is wisdom in that. The problem is that for a senior industrial leader or an executive on international assignment, the demands are frequently not negotiable. The market will not slow down for your well-being. What you can build, deliberately, is the resource side of the equation. More autonomy where it can be found, stronger support around you, real recovery rather than the performance of recovery, and meaning reconnected, made conscious again. Look at your own situation. Here is a practical question. Of your resources, autonomy, support, recovery, meaning, which is the one you could begin to rebuild first? You do not always get to choose the size of the storm, but you have far more say than you think over the strength of the boat. So let me bring you back to the sailboat one final time, and let me show you the whole journey from its deck. Using this metaphor, we will see that each letter of forge, it turns out, was a movement in a single voyage. Focus was choosing the destination, deciding where the bow should point when 1,000 voices were shouting 1,000 directions at once. Overcome was removing the unnecessary cargo, releasing the weight that was slowing the vessel and serving no one, the burdens we carry out of habit long after they have stopped belonging to us. Reinvent was repairing the vessel itself, recognizing that the structure built for calmer waters had become unfit for these, and having the courage to rebuild it. Grow was strengthening the crew and improving the sails, building the conditions, the resources, the capability, so that the boat could carry more without breaking. And excel is the act of navigation itself. Sailing the journey, reading the conditions, adjusting continuously, moving with intention through a sea you will never command. That returns us to the thought I planted at the very beginning. Perhaps Forge was never really about performance in the narrow sense. Performance was always the visible outcome. Navigation was the deeper capability. Because performance is what others observe. Navigation is what allows it to endure. At the start of this series, we met a leader who was drifting. Pressure was setting the direction, expectations were setting the pace, urgency was setting the priorities. And little by little, almost imperceptibly, the person began to disappear behind the role. Through focus, that leader recovered direction. Through overcome, he released the burdens that had stopped belonging to him. Through reinvent, he redesigned the structures that pressure had quietly made obsolete. Through grow, he rebuilt the conditions for his own development. And now, we arrive at excel. Not as the end of the journey, but as a way of traveling. Let me now explain clearly what excellence is and what it is not. Excellence is not perfection, and the leader who waits for perfect conditions will wait forever. Excellence is not constant achievement, an unbroken line of victories with no setback and no recovery. And excellence is certainly not simply working harder than everyone around you, burning a fuel that does not refill. Excellence is the sustainable expression of your capabilities, in service of what matters most. It is sustainable because it can be carried for years rather than weeks. It is the expression of your capabilities, because it draws something out of you rather than only grinding something down. That something is in service of what matters, because without that, even the highest performance is just well-disguised drift. And as you leave this series, I suggest you carry 5 questions out of it. Not 5 answers, 5 questions. Which fuel are you burning? How is the balance between your challenges and your skills? Are you accumulating years or accumulating mastery? Do you work the recovery or the verdict? And which of your resources will you rebuild first? A navigator who keeps asking the right questions is never fully adrift. Here is the last thing I want to leave with you. The wind never disappears. The storms never disappear. The uncertainty never disappears. If you have been waiting for the conditions to calm down before you can finally lead the way you want to, I want to release you gently from that weight. They will not calm down. The sea is the sea. What changes is your relationship to it. And perhaps that is the real opposite of drift. Not control, but navigation. Perhaps that is also why the orchestra image was never quite enough. An orchestra performs in a controlled environment. A sailboat moves through uncertainty. The conductor sets the tempo. The sailor reads the conditions. Looking back, I think we needed both. One image helped us understand the complexity of leadership. The other helps us understand the reality of it. And with that, we've reached the end of the series. I'm Alain Coadou. I created The Forge because I believe that what happens before breakdown deserves as much attention as breakdown itself. That drift is not a weakness. It is what pressure does to human beings over time. And I believe that the ability to recognize it early and to navigate it with care carries something rare. The ability to sustain not just performance, but ourselves. If you recognize something of yourself in what we explored across this series, perhaps that is where the real work starts. And if you would like to explore what recalibration might look like in your own context, you will find me at alaincoadou.com. This was The Forge Conversations. Thank you for listening.